Caleb Foster had always taken pride in his home in Evergreen Ridge, a picturesque suburban community known for its well-manicured lawns and strict HOA regulations. For the past 6 years, he had meticulously cared for his lush, 6-foot privacy hedges, trimming them every Saturday morning like clockwork. They weren't just for aesthetics. They were his sanctuary, shielding him from the prying eyes of his nosy neighbor, Martha Langley, who had complained multiple times at HOA meetings about how his hedges ruined the neighborhood's open feel. But when Caleb returned home after a long day at work, his heart slammed against his ribs. The once tall hedges were gone, reduced to ugly 3-foot stumps. A bright yellow notice was taped to his front door. His hands trembled as he read it. Vegetation violation corrected. $750 landscaping fee applied, signed. Evergreen Ridge, HOA rage boiled inside him. They had no right. His hedges were within regulations. He clenched his fists as he noticed Martha Langley standing on her porch, smirking, pretending to water her roses. But what the HOA didn't know? Caleb Foster wasn't just any homeowner. He was their new financial auditor, and he had just been given a golden opportunity to uncover what was really going on behind the scenes. Caleb's pulse pounded as he stormed into his house, slamming the door behind him. He could still hear Martha Langley's mocking chuckle from across the street. His mind raced. This wasn't just about his hedges. This was personal. Grabbing a measuring tape from his garage, he marched outside and measured the remains of his hedges. Exactly 3 feet. His hands tightened around the tape measure. They had been 6 feet tall. He had measured them every week. His breath hitched. They had trespassed onto his property and butchered them for no reason. He yanked his phone from his pocket and called the Evergreen Ridge HOA office. His fingers trembled with fury. Evergreen Ridge HOA, this is Linda speaking. This is Caleb Foster from 112 Oakwood Drive. My hedges were destroyed without warning, and I found a $750 fine on my door. Who authorized this? A brief pause, then the sound of typing. Yes, Mr. Foster. We received multiple complaints about your hedges being a visibility hazard. The board voted last Thursday to have them removed. Didn't you read the community email? Caleb's stomach dropped. What email? I never received any notice, and my hedges were within regulations. Linda's voice turned cold and dismissive. The board determined they were a violation. The vote was unanimous. If you have concerns, you may file an appeal, but the fine stands. Caleb clenched his jaw. This wasn't just unfair, it was illegal. Just then, a sleek black SUV slowed in front of his house. Rebecca Holloway, the HOA president, rolled down her window. Her perfectly styled blonde bob didn't move as she smirked. The neighborhood looks so much better now, Caleb. Finally, you're in compliance. He stepped closer, his blood boiling. I was already in compliance, Rebecca. You trespassed. You destroyed my property. That's illegal. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes turned to steel. The board has the authority to enforce regulations. Next time, check your email. She started rolling up her window, but Caleb took a step forward. You targeted me, just like you did to the Parkers when they refused to pay that mystery fee last year. Rebecca's window froze halfway up. Her expression darkened. Be careful with your accusations, Caleb. This community runs on rules and respect. Some people just have trouble with both. The SUV sped off, leaving Caleb standing in his yard, seething. But before he could even begin to plan his next move, his phone buzzed with an email notification. Your employment with Evergreen Ridge HOA has been confirmed. Please report on Monday as our new financial auditor. Caleb stared at the screen. They had no idea. For the first time that day, he smiled. Caleb barely slept that night. Through his now exposed bedroom window, he could see Rebecca's house, lights flickering as several board members arrived for an unscheduled meeting. Something was happening, and it wasn't just about his hedges. At dawn, Caleb threw on a hoodie and drove straight to the county records office. The clerk raised an eyebrow as he slid a request form across the counter. "Doing some home improvements?" she asked. Caleb forced a smile. "More like solving a mystery." Minutes later, he flipped open a massive binder of property records. His gut twisted as he ran his finger over the documents. The HOA had zero easement rights to his land. They had no legal authority to touch his hedges. But that wasn't all. Caleb's eyes narrowed as he spotted something suspicious. The landscaping company that destroyed his hedges, Greenleaf Solutions, had only been registered 3 months ago. The listed owner? Michael Holloway, Rebecca Holloway's brother. His stomach dropped. This was a racket. Firing up his phone camera, Caleb snapped photos of every document and sped out of the office. He had proof, but now he needed to know who was pulling the strings. The neighbor who knew too much, his next stop? Martha Langley's house. She had always been too eager to meddle in HOA affairs. Caleb knocked firmly. The door cracked open, and Martha's smug expression faltered when she saw him. "Oh, Caleb, what a surprise." He folded his arms. "Good morning, Martha. Funny thing, I was at the county office today and found out my hedges weren't breaking any rules. But you already knew that, didn't you?" Martha's eyes darted to the side. "Well, I only mentioned at the garden club that they blocked my view of the street. Rebecca said she'd handle it." Caleb's pulse spiked. "Without any formal complaint? Without notifying me?" Martha shifted on her feet. "Look, I didn't mean for them to get hacked down, but Rebecca said it was a safety issue, and you know how she is. Once she decides something, it's final." Caleb took a step forward. "When did the HOA start waiving water restriction violations for garden club members?" Martha's face drained of color. She slammed the door shut without another word. The real reason his hedges were targeted. Caleb spent the next 3 hours walking the neighborhood, documenting every rule violation that had been mysteriously overlooked. Rebecca's massive non-regulation gazebo. Board member Rob Davidson's commercial truck parked illegally overnight. Diane Bradford's newly built fence, untouched by HOA fines. Yet his perfectly legal hedges had been cut down without warning. As he snapped a picture of Rebecca's custom mailbox, a familiar black SUV pulled up beside him. Rebecca rolled down her window, her eyes cold as ice. "Taking up a new hobby, Caleb?" He smiled. "Just admiring the neighborhood. Lots of interesting rule exceptions." Her fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "Neighbors who cooperate tend to find reasonable compromises. Those who cause trouble, well, they tend to find themselves under more scrutiny." Caleb's stomach churned. That was a threat. Just then, his phone buzzed. An email from Thomas Grayson, the only board member who ever stood up to Rebecca. "We need to talk. ASAP. Meet me at Riverside Park in 20 minutes. Caleb turned back to Rebecca, his heart pounding. "We'll see who's really under scrutiny, Rebecca." As he walked away, he could feel her glare burning into his back. Caleb arrived at Riverside Park just as the early Thomas Grayson. The Thomas looked around nervously before sliding a cup of coffee across the table. "I don't have much time," he said. "Rebecca is planning something big. Your hedges? That was just the beginning." Caleb leaned in. What do you mean? Thomas exhaled slowly. The board's voting next week on a community beautification project, a complete renovation plan for Evergreen Ridge. The contract is worth $1.2 million. Caleb's stomach clenched. Let me guess, he muttered. The contract is going to Greenleaf Solutions. Thomas nodded grimly. They're trying to funnel the entire budget into Rebecca's brother's company. But they need to move fast before the financial audit flags any irregularities. Caleb's heart hammered. The audit they hired me to conduct. Thomas's expression darkened. Exactly. But Rebecca doesn't know it's you yet. She just knew they needed to hire someone fast to satisfy the bank's requirements for the HOA loan application. A slow, cold realization settled over Caleb. They planned to drain the community's reserve funds, then take out a massive loan, one that every homeowner would be forced to repay in increased fees. And it was all a scam. Caleb gritted his teeth. So they're not just targeting me. They're robbing the entire neighborhood. Thomas pulled a folder from his bag and slid it across the table. I can't prove it alone. I'm just one vote against 6. But if you can connect the dots, we might have a chance. Caleb flipped through the pages. Payment records, invoices, and emails. The deeper he looked, the worse it got. Landscaping expenses had tripled in the past year. Greenleaf Solutions had already received over $200,000 for emergency vegetation management. His own hedge removal had been billed at $1,500, half of which was charged to him, the other half to HOA funds. His pulse pounded in his ears. This is fraud. We can take this to the authorities. Thomas hesitated. Caleb, be careful. The last person who tried to go against Rebecca found himself suddenly unemployed after she made a few concerned calls to his boss. Caleb scoffed. I'm not afraid of Rebecca. Thomas stared at him, dead serious. You should be. Caleb blinked. Why? Thomas's voice dropped to a whisper. Because she's watching us right now. Caleb's breath caught. Slowly, he turned his head. Across the pond, Rebecca's black SUV sat parked under the shade of an oak tree. Through the tinted windshield, he could see her silhouette watching them, his jaw clenched. Let her watch. Because come Monday morning, she'd be watching her entire corrupt empire start to crumble. Monday morning arrived, thick with tension. Caleb straightened his tie, grabbed his briefcase stuffed with evidence, and drove to the Evergreen Ridge HOA office. But this time, he wasn't just another frustrated homeowner. He was walking in as their new financial auditor. As soon as he pushed open the glass doors, the room fell silent. Linda, the HOA receptionist, blinked up at him in shock. Mr. Foster, what are you doing here? Caleb flashed his new security badge. Starting my new job. Linda's face drained of color. Papers slipped from her hands as she fumbled to type something into her computer. Caleb leaned in. I'll need full access to all financial records for the past 5 years. Let's start with landscaping expenditures. Linda's hands trembled as she logged him into the system. Rebecca usually handles those files personally. Caleb smirked. Well, today I'm handling them. For the next 4 hours, he combed through financial statements, invoices, and bank transfers. The deeper he went, the clearer the scam became. Greenleaf Solutions had been overcharging the HOA by triple the standard rates. Rebecca's personal account showed multiple unexplained deposits, matching Greenleaf's payouts. Certain board members' fines had been mysteriously erased, while outspoken residents were slapped with bogus violations. Caleb's hands shook as he printed copies of key documents. This wasn't just corruption. It was embezzlement. A shadow fell across his desk. The air went cold. "Mr. Foster." He looked up. Rebecca Holloway stood in the doorway. Her perfectly polished nails tapped against the doorframe. "I didn't realize you'd be working here today," she said, voice smooth as silk. Caleb leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Funny how things work out, huh?" Rebecca's eyes flicked to the printed documents on his desk. Her smile faltered, just for a second. "I trust you're finding everything in order?" she asked. Caleb smiled. "Oh, absolutely. In fact, I'd love to go over some findings with you, like why our community's reserve funds have mysteriously dropped 40% over the past 2 years, with no major improvements to justify it." Rebecca's smile vanished. Her fingers tightened around the doorframe. Caleb could see the storm brewing in her eyes. "You're making a very dangerous mistake, Caleb." His heart pounded, but he kept his voice calm. "No, Rebecca. You made the mistake when you thought you could keep getting away with this." Rebecca exhaled sharply, then took a slow step forward, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. I built this HOA from the ground up, and I can bury you just as easily." Caleb didn't flinch. "Try it. I dare you." Because her empire was already crumbling, and she had no idea what was coming next. Caleb's hands tightened into fists under the table, but he forced himself to stay calm. Rebecca Holloway was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were dangerous. She had just threatened him. Good. That meant she was scared. Caleb leaned back in his chair, keeping his expression unreadable. "You should be careful with threats, Rebecca. You never know when someone might be recording." For the first time, her mask cracked. Her eyes flicked toward his desk, scanning for any hidden devices. Caleb didn't have one, but she didn't know that. Before she could speak, a loud knock at the office door made both of them turn. Thomas Grayson stepped inside, his face unreadable. "Rebecca, the board needs you in the conference room. Now!" Rebecca's lips thinned into a tight line. "I'm in the middle of something, Thomas." "Number you're not." The steel in Thomas's voice surprised even Caleb. Rebecca hesitated. Then, with one last warning glare at Caleb, she strode out. Caleb stood to follow, his heartbeat thrumming like a war drum. The board meeting. Let the games begin. When Caleb stepped into the packed conference room, he immediately felt the tension. The entire HOA board was there. So were dozens of homeowners. And at the center of the room, a large projector screen waiting to be used. Caleb exchanged a glance with Thomas. This was it. Rebecca took her seat at the head of the table, clearly uneasy. "Before we begin official business," she said quickly, "I need to address a serious issue regarding our new financial auditor." "Actually, Rebecca," Caleb interrupted, his voice carrying across the room, "I have a presentation of my own." Rebecca's head snapped toward him. "Excuse me?" Caleb held up the HOA bylaws booklet, already flipped to a specific page. Article 7, Section 3 states that any resident may present relevant financial information at a public HOA meeting. And trust me, what I have to share is very relevant. The room stirred with murmurs. Thomas cleared his throat. "The bylaws do allow it, Rebecca." Rebecca's knuckles turned white around the papers in front of her. "Fine," she hissed. 5 minutes. Caleb picked up the remote. "That's all I need." With one click, the screen lit up. The first image? A photo of his destroyed hedges. "Many of you saw what happened to my property last week. What you don't know is why." Click. A screenshot of emails between Rebecca and Linda, specifically ordering the removal of his hedges. The email was dated one day after Caleb had questioned HOA spending at last month's meeting. Gasps rippled through the room. Rebecca lunged forward. "These are private communications. You have no right." "Actually, as HOA auditor, I have every right," Caleb cut in. He clicked again. Click. A financial breakdown showing Greenleaf Solutions had received over $500,000 in HOA funds since 2021. Greenleaf Solutions was owned by Rebecca's brother. The HOA had been paying triple the market rate for landscaping services. The room erupted into angry whispers. An elderly man stood up. "They charged me $900 to trim a single tree last spring. Said it was an emergency removal." Caleb nodded. "The actual cost?" $350. Rebecca was losing control of the room. "These accusations are baseless," she snapped. "The board has always acted in the best interest of this community." A frail woman near the front stood up. It was Mrs. Jenkins, one of the longest-standing residents. "Then explain this, Rebecca. You fined me for my rose bushes being too tall, but you never cited Diane Bradford's illegal swimming pool extension." Diane went pale. Rebecca's breathing turned ragged. Caleb clicked again. Click. A financial graph showing the HOA's reserve funds plummeting by 40% over the last 2 years. The beautification project proposal showing a $1.2 million contract, awarded to Greenleaf Solutions. Emails suggesting Rebecca was planning to take out a loan to cover the costs, forcing homeowners to pay higher fees. The room exploded. "You were going to drain our reserve funds? For your own gain?" someone shouted. "How much money have you stolen from us?" Another voice roared. Rebecca's face turned ghostly pale. She slammed her hand on the table. "This meeting is adjourned." But Thomas rose from his seat. "Point of order," he said, voice firm. "A meeting cannot be adjourned without a vote." The room fell silent. "Motion to continue the meeting and vote for an independent forensic audit of HOA finances?" "Seconded," a dozen voices shouted at once. Rebecca staggered back in her chair, her entire body trembling. Thomas nodded toward the room. "All in favor?" Nearly every hand went up. Rebecca was finished. Rebecca's face twisted in fury as she stared at the raised hands around the room. She had lost. Completely. For 15 years, she had ruled Evergreen Ridge like her personal kingdom, silencing opposition, lining her pockets with homeowners' money, and crushing anyone who dared challenge her authority. And now, it was all slipping through her fingers. "This is a witch hunt," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I have given my life to this community." Caleb folded his arms, watching her unravel. "No, Rebecca. You've stolen from this community. There's a difference." Rebecca's breath came in short, panicked bursts. Her gaze darted toward the door, her only escape. But before she could run, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "Mrs. Holloway?" The crowd turned as 2 men in dark suits stepped forward. Detectives. One of them held up a warrant. "Rebecca Holloway, you are under investigation for financial fraud, misappropriation of funds, and falsifying HOA financial records." A collective gasp swept through the room. Rebecca went rigid. For the first time, she looked truly afraid. "What?" she stammered. "You can't be serious. I'm the victim here. It's him." She jabbed a manicured finger at Caleb. "He's lying." "He set me up." The detective didn't flinch. "We have forensic accountants reviewing the HOA's financial transactions, and we have enough preliminary evidence to warrant a full criminal investigation." Rebecca started shaking, Her carefully crafted empire was collapsing in real time. Caleb watched, heart pounding, as she frantically turned to the board members. "You idiots, do something!" But no one moved. Even Diane Bradford, one of her closest allies, averted her gaze, her face pale. Caleb took a step forward, keeping his voice steady. "Face it, Rebecca. It's over." And with one final glare, Rebecca grabbed her purse, shoved past the detectives, and stormed out. The door slammed behind her. For a moment, the room was silent. Then, a slow clap. Caleb turned to see Thomas Grayson smirking, and just like that, the tension snapped. The room erupted into cheers. Neighbors clapped Caleb on the back, shaking his hand, thanking him. Mrs. Jenkins wiped a tear from her eye. "Young man, I've lived here since before the HOA existed. What you did tonight? Took guts." Caleb smiled. "Sometimes you have to stand your ground." The aftermath, rebuilding what was broken. Rebecca resigned the next morning. An emergency HOA election was held, and Thomas Grayson was voted in as the new president. All HOA financial records were turned over to forensic auditors. By the end of the month, multiple board members were indicted for fraud. And Evergreen Ridge? It became a real community again. Caleb stood in his front yard a few weeks later, watching as tiny green shoots pushed up from the soil, his new hedges. Thomas joined him, hands in his pockets. "They'll take a while to grow back." Caleb smiled. "That's okay. So will this neighborhood." And for the first time in a long time, Evergreen Ridge felt like home.